One of the issues that's occurred over the course of the last 10 years in particular, and we saw this early on, right after Barack Obama was elected president, there was this movement, and we saw Occupy Wall Street. And there's all these millennials that went to occupy Wall Street and protest these big major corporations that were taking advantage of the little guy, right? This was really kind of the first big movement where people kind of really brought attention to the burgeoning wealth gap that was occurring at the time because of the financial crisis. And nobody really paid much attention to it because we made more fun of them than anything because, they're up there, protesting, big corporations that were taking control of everything. So, they're up there protesting on their Apple iPhones and their Apple iPads and, they're drinking Starbucks while they're protesting. They're protesting the big corporations by supporting them in their protest. But it was the first kind of shot across the bow where people actually kind of woke up to this idea. It's like, hey, wait a second, what's happening here? Well, it's just millennials. We don't care. But over the course of the decade, as we continued to, increase our debts, increase our deficits, there were a lot of wranglings up in Washington. We had congressmen on our show. We talked to Congressman Kevin Brady. We talked to John Culberson, a variety of others on the show about, and these were the guys that were that were the head of, these committees on finance and budgets and controls in Washington. And we were asking them questions like, hey, what are we doing about this, burgeoning deficit? Now, this was when Obama was still president, and we had doubled the national debt at that point. Everybody was up in arms about this $9 trillion increase in the national debt. We'd gone from $9 trillion under George Bush to $18 trillion in debt under Barack Obama. Everybody was very upset about this because we were worried about the future of our country, and rightfully so. There's a very high correlation between what happens with debts and deficits and economic prosperity. We were very upset about this. So we elect Donald Trump president because, we're going to fix this situation. Well, here we are now, and we warned about this on the show over the last couple of years. We said, hey, you're running $1 trillion deficit going into an economic recession. And it's just a function of time till we get a recession, and all you need is a trigger event that causes it. But here you are, right? So we were worried about trade wars with China rather than paying attention to our national debts and deficits, rather than paying attention to what was happening with real economic growth. And we were warning on the show, saying, look at the economic data. It doesn't support what you're saying. What's going to happen here when you're carrying this much corporate leverage, this much personal leverage, this much government leverage, is that something's going to come along that trips this whole thing up, and then you're going to have a real problem. So the virus shows up. No, and again, we said on the show is that nobody knows what the event will be. I don't know how many times I said this on the show, is that nobody knows what the event will be when it comes. If we know about it, the trade war, right? Not going to be that's not going to trigger the recession. We all know about it. Markets price in this stuff. If they know about it, they're going to price it in. The thing that always gets the markets is the thing they can't predict, right? Virus. So the virus comes along, and now we shut down the economy, and now we're having to do massive levels of funding, right? The Federal Reserve is increasing debt at an alarming pace. Of course, we're spending, $2 trillion here. We throw around billions as if they're pennies now. Trillions are an easy number. Oh, we just need $1 trillion for that and $1 trillion for that. Just a reminder, $1 trillion is, if you could spend $1 million a day from the time that Jesus walked the earth, you still wouldn't have spent $1 trillion, just to put it in context. $1 trillion is an immense amount of money, but yet we've lost sight of billions, and we've lost sight of millions because we're now talking trillions, and we just throw these numbers around with no consequence. Stephanie Kelton was the economic advisor for Bernie Sanders. She's the big promoter of modern monetary theory, which says debts and deficits simply don't matter. We can just run debts to the moon as long as there's no inflation. What she doesn't talk about is the impact to economic prosperity. The reason that America is wealthy And I'm not talking about a little bit wealthy. I'm talking about head and shoulders wealthy above every other country in the entire world. There's a reason that we built that wealth. There's also a reason that other countries in the world didn't have the wealth creation ability that we had. And there's a lot of people right now hoping that we're going to have this V-shaped recovery in the economy. And if we go back to 2008 for a moment and we think about the decline that we had in GDP, we were growing at about 4% economic growth prior to the financial crisis. Coming out of the financial crisis, we expand our debts and deficits and we grow at about 2% on average for the last decade. And you go, wait a minute, hold on a second. So we're growing at a slower rate? Yes. In fact, after every recession, the recovery back has always been back to a lower level of growth than we did previously. And there's just a steady downtrend in economic growth since 1980. And there's some reasons for that. And this is also the reason why other countries around the world economically, and as I said before the break, if you take a look at the wealth of the United States versus other countries, it's not a little bit more wealthy. It's a lot more wealthy. Let me put it this way. We talk about the 1% versus the 99. If you're listening to the show right now and you make $30,000 a year, I have good news for you. You're in the top 1% of income earners globally. It's pretty amazing. Now, living in the U.S., if you're making $30,000, you're actually below poverty level, right? It takes $50,000 a year just to support a family of four. I'm just talking about getting by. I got 4 kids, and it takes me $50,000 to pull out of the driveway. So I honestly, people that raise 4, 5, 6 kids on 50 grand a year, amazing job. But if you make $30,000 a year, you're in the top 1% of income earners globally. Think about that for a moment. It's amazing. We have just a tremendous amount of wealth in the U.S., but yet we have this problem that we can't create stronger levels of economic growth. And that's because of debts and deficits and leverage. And I'm not talking about just government debt. We're talking about record household debt, record corporate debt, record government debt, record margin debt, record bank loan debt. I mean, you look at debt levels everywhere. In any corner of the U.S. economy, they're at record levels. There's nowhere you can look and go, oh, yeah, well, there's no debt over there. No, there's debt everywhere. Student loan debt record. And there's this very misleading chart that runs around that people want to throw out there. And they go, well, look at debt as compared to disposable personal incomes. Low level. That's because we have low interest rates. You can take on more debt because you've got low interest payments, right? It's complete bull hockey. The reason is that the wealth gap, the income gap in the U.S. is so enormous. The top 10% of income earners make so much more money than the bottom 90% that it skews those disposable personal income numbers. You have to break it out by fifths. So you can break it down and look at, how much income, because if you have a lot of income, you don't have any debt. I mean, I meet with people every day that have no debt. They've got high levels of income. They have a large amount of savings. They have no debt. And people that save money, there's a great book out. If you ever need to get kind of a kick in the butt about getting your finances together, go read a book called The Millionaire Next Door. I talk to these people every day, these millionaires next door. These are guys that live next door to you. They drive a 15-year-old pickup truck. They live in a normal-sized house, 3-bedroom, 2 baths. They've lived in it for 30 years, whatever. They wear blue jeans and button-downs. By the way, residents of Maryland have been warned to wear pants when they go check their mail. This home lockdown thing is going a little bit too far. Put your pants on when you go to the mailbox. These are the guys that live next door to you. They've got a couple $1 million in the bank. You would never know it, right? Because they save money. They have no debt. They save money. They're frugal, and they live life. And this was also kind of the genesis of the whole FIRE movement, which is now embers at this point. But the point is that debt is an erosion to economic growth, because if I have debt, it deters whatever income I have coming in goes out to pay the interest on the debt. I can't create economic growth if I'm supporting debt. And so when we went from $9 trillion in debt to 18 trillion in debt, we slowed economic growth because we're spending more on social welfare and we're spending more on debt service payments, etc. 96% of all our tax revenue prior to this economic recession went to support just Social Security, Medicare, Medicaid, prescription drug benefits, and interest on the debt. Everything else was paid for through debt. Defense, education, all that type of stuff. Now, coming in this recession and coming out of it, all of our, and considering that tax revenue is going to drop sharply for the government, we're going to require more than 100% just to support social welfare, period. Everything else, including interest on the debt, is going to come out of deficits. More debts, more deficits, you're going to have lower rates of economic prosperity. And this is what other countries around the world have been experiencing for decades. Socialism, communism, all these type of government structures, right? They're all based upon debt. What do you have in those countries? You have a big disparity between the top income earners and everybody else, except there, it's not the top 10% versus the bottom 90, it's the top 1 versus the bottom 99. It truly is the Occupy Wall Street movement in Europe. The wealthy are very wealthy. The poor are basically poor. And this is a function of how socialism works. Socialism, communism, all these work in just manners to extract capital from those that make up the population to enriching the wealthy. Those in power are wealthy. If you're not in power, you're not wealthy, period. And when we take a look at these environments and again, where money is spent and what happens, there is an inability to create stronger rates of economic growth. And it all ties back to debts and deficits. In fact, prior to 1980, just here in the U.S., let's get back to the U.S., prior to 1980, we had accelerating rates of economic growth. In other words, coming out of the war in 1944, we were growing at about 4% growth, and we went to 5, we went to 6, we went to 7, we went to 8. In the 70s, despite the fact that we had the crash of 1974, we had Vietnam War, we had the oil embargo, we were growing at about 8%. Savings rates for consumers were running 8, 9%. Yes, interest rates were going up and inflation was going up, but we had plenty of economic growth and personal savings, and guess what? No deficit. Beginning in 1980, though, we changed that dynamic. We deregulated the financial industry. We started cutting rates. We got the Federal Reserve involved in monetary policy. And for the next 40 years, we've had continued slower rates of economic growth, continued slower rates of economic prosperity, rising level of debts and rising deficits, and now we're about to make it far worse. So, what's the common denominator? Debt. And the problem is that now we think the debt is the only solution to solving problems. We can't allow capitalism to work. We cannot allow companies to basically file for bankruptcy, restructure, and reform and come out and provide better economic benefits on the back end. We don't want capitalism to work. And because we've now disallowed capitalism, the function of working, we have indeed moved towards a socialistic backdrop in the economy, which is where the government takes control. And that's fine. It may seem okay right now, but over the next 5 years, 10 years, we're going to look back at this moment and say we had the opportunity to make the right decisions and we failed to do so. The price we will pay will be economic growth around 1%. Economic prosperity will get worse. The wealth gap will increase. And people will become more upset about not making the right choices down the road. We had the opportunity. We blew it. Be right back.
I'm worse at what I do best, and always get feel blessed. Our little crew has always been.
Got questions for Lance later? Ask now at realinvestmentadvice.com.